Welcome everyone. My name is Mary Lamuno. I am a lead content developer here at Wall Street Notes. And today I'm basically going to be sharing with all of you the exact step-by-step strategy that we recommend to all of our students who are studying for the CFA exam. And it's actually the same strategy that I used when I took the level 1 exam. And it's what helped me score above the 90th percentile on the first try. So the first time that I took the test, and also above the 70th percentile in every single one of the topics that are tested on the exam. So it is a proven strategy that is made up of three main stages: learning, reinforcing, and remembering. Now, we will be talking about the details in a moment. Don't worry if this looks very complicated right now, but the reason why it works so well is because it's going to help you save a lot of time in the first stage. It's going to help you build a very solid knowledge foundation in the second stage, and it's going to boost your memory without sacrificing time in the third stage. So this is going to be a brief webinar, about 20 minutes long, but it's packed with everything that you could possibly need to know if you're thinking about taking the CFA exam or if you're already enrolled. So we're going to be going over things like why you should take the CFA, what materials you should be using, what the ideal study strategy is, and what the top performers are doing to score in the highest percentiles. So if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat and someone from our team will try to get to all of those during the webinar. It will also be recorded. So if you need to access any section of this webinar later on, you're going to be able to access it once it's done. So let's get started and take a look at the strategy. I'm sure you've heard that the pass rates for the exam have been historically low, right? Sometimes as low as 22%. Now, on top of that, everyone is studying from the same textbook. They're probably doing the same practice questions. So it's clearly not enough to just read the textbook, right? If you really want to score among the highest percentiles, you need to be more efficient than other candidates when you study. So what this means is that if you're going to spend an average of 300 hours studying, every resource that you use should help you either learn the material faster, it should help you cut down study time, or it should help you remember what you learn. So just keep that in mind for now as we go through the strategy. Now, it doesn't matter if you're taking the CFA exam in a week, or if you have several months before you sit for the test, or even if you're a student and you're just here to get a head start and begin preparing early, that's great. And we're going to go over what you can do to boost your score, regardless of where you are on the CFA study journey. So let's start with the simple question: why even take the CFA? And if you're here, it goes without saying, I'm sure you know that the CFA charter is considered one of the most prestigious accreditations in the industry. So it's extremely well regarded by investment firms and by employers. So in terms of career opportunities and career growth, you're already on the right path if you're watching this and you're considering getting the charter. So let's go back to the ideal study strategy and break it down into its components. Now, when I first started studying for the test, I remember being very overwhelmed because I would sit down to study and I wasn't sure if I was on track. I wasn't even sure if I was studying correctly. So what I want to do is give you a roadmap that you can follow to make sure that whenever you sit down to study, you know exactly what you have to work on. So the most important thing and the best piece of advice that I can give you is to keep it simple. As I mentioned before, the ideal study strategy is composed of three parts. You have to become familiar with the material, you have to master every concept, and finally, you need to remember everything on exam day. So that sounds simple in theory, right? But if it were that easy, the pass rates would not be as low as they are. So let's take a look at where students are making mistakes or where they're going wrong. So the first common mistake students make is spending way too much time taking notes or making outlines when they're trying to understand the material for the first time, which I understand, right? It's about 3,000 pages of written content that you have to get through. So it is a lot of material. Now, another problem that I see is that students don't really know how to keep track of what they already learned. And so they might be spending a lot of hours studying, but they're not necessarily productive hours. And then one of the biggest issues that I see as well is that students move on to new material, new concepts, and then they very slowly start to forget what they already learned. And so they panic and they start rereading what they already studied, which is incredibly inefficient. And then in the end, they end up not being able to cover all of the material. They might even have to skip topics like ethics, which you shouldn't do. And so they start to forget everything at the same time. So if this sounds like you, don't worry, because we're going to go over how to avoid every single one of these problems and how you should move through these 3 stages of learning, mastering, and remembering. So to explain the strategy, let's use equities as an example. So assume that you have 2 weeks to master equities and that there are 7 readings within the topic. Now, how in the world do you go from not knowing anything to mastering it and actually remembering it within that time frame? Now, let's zoom into the first step, which is learning the material. So we're going to start with the first reading in equities. So the very first thing that I would do was to watch a short video to become familiar with the content. And just this step alone saved me so many study hours later on. Now, in terms of videos, Wall Street Notes was created specifically to help you with this step because, like I mentioned before, you can go through the average reading in only 10 minutes. And they also make sure that every single learning outcome is covered. So you can be sure that you're not skipping any material, and they keep the animations very simple so that you can start remembering them easily. Now, once you watch the video, the next step is to work through the textbook. Now, the textbook can be very dry, as I'm sure you know, but thankfully you've already watched the video. So you're going to be able to fly through the textbook a lot faster than someone who is trying to understand it for the first time by just reading the book. Now, if you have a lot of time, you should use the CFA textbook just because that's what the test is based on, right? If you prefer another provider like Kaplan, which is the one that I used, that's okay too. If you're running a little bit short on time, you can always refer back to the original CFA textbook if you want to go more in depth or if you're not understanding a specific topic. So during this step, you don't need to waste time making outlines or taking notes because the videos already did that for you. So if you're going to take notes, I recommend that you make flashcards with key formulas or even like common mistakes. So these are highlighted in the Wall Street Notes videos, and you'll also find them as you read through the textbook. Now, the thing about level 1 is that it's not as ambiguous as levels 2 or 3, right? It's more about, do you know the formulas? Do you know them well? And can you apply them quickly? So that's it for the first stage. It's pretty straightforward. You just need to have a basic understanding of the material. So let's move on to stage 2, which is reinforcement. Now, the main way we do this is through active learning, so practice questions. Now, you should always prioritize the practice questions that were created by the CFA Institute because they're the ones who write the test. So we recommend that for every reading that you do, you also complete the end of the chapter questions in the CFA textbook. And if you have extra time, you can also go through the questions that are scattered inside the chapter. If you have a third-party provider like Kaplan, you can also do the end of the chapter questions that they have, which is also good for extra practice. So after you're done with these questions at the end of the reading, you have reached what we call the halfway checkpoint. So this means that you're familiar with the reading and you've done some practice questions that relate specifically to that reading. So now what you need to do is repeat this process with the rest of that readings in that section. So in this case, it's all the readings included in equities. Now, once they all reach that halfway checkpoint, you're ready to move on to the most important step, which is where you're really going to hone in and master the topic. Now, I usually did this over the weekend because I had more time to just focus. There's not as many distractions. So what you're going to do is you're going to access the learning ecosystem, which you can find by logging into the CFA portal. And you're going to answer as many questions as possible for the reading or the topic like equities that you're studying. So at the beginning, you probably won't be timing yourself, but as you do more and more questions, do try to stick to that 90-second mark. So you never want to spend more than 90 seconds for one single question. So the secret to making this process more efficient is to keep a simple log of your mistakes. So what you can do is you're going to take a list of learning objectives in the reading, and every time that you get a question wrong for that learning objective, you're just going to mark it. So once you've done a good amount of questions, you're going to start to notice where your weak points are. And that's when you can go back and rewatch that video for the learning objective that you don't really understand. So on Wall Street Notes, it is very easy to do this because the learning objectives are listed at the top of the screen. So it only takes about 1 minute to find and review a single objective. Now, this is where you're going to start to realize that maybe you need to work on memorizing formulas. Or maybe you're struggling with definitions, or maybe you simply need to rewatch the video one more time because you keep forgetting that concept. So the way our brain works when memorizing things is kind of like that game of Tetris, right? The first time you watch the video, you're laying a foundation. Next, you do practice questions to reinforce the knowledge. And then you might even have to go back a couple of times and rewatch a couple of learning objectives to fill in those gaps. So this strategy is all about finding those gaps, being able to realize what your weak points are, and then being able to address them as quickly as possible. So a very common mistake that I see students make is to start doing mock tests very early on in the process. The reason why this is not very effective is because the mock test might only have 5 or 6 questions that are related to the reading that you're trying to master. So it is significantly more effective to focus on answering questions for one reading or for one single topic at a time. And then once you're sure that you've mastered that, then you can do mock tests that have everything scattered and everything mixed together. So the good news is that once you've done this, once you've answered the practice questions and you're confident with it, you're ready to move on to the last step, which is simply remembering. Now, this is all about keeping the material fresh in your mind and retaining what you've already worked so hard to master. Now, one of the best ways to remember the material is to use spaced repetition during your free time to keep those concepts fresh. So if you're at lunch, or if you're at the gym, or you're commuting to work, you can use that time to get ahead of other candidates who are wasting their time having to sit down to reread the book. So if you use Wall Street Notes for this step, you can review an entire topic like equities or corporate issuers in just about an hour. So if you take an hour at lunch or at the gym, you could potentially be reviewing a different topic every single day. So now that equities is in the memory phase, it can just stay there, kind of refreshing while we move on to new topics in the remainder of the curriculum. And once a topic has reached the memory phase, I know that there's a lot of students who track their progress by color coding the learning objectives, which is the same thing that I did. So red basically means that you need to keep rewatching those videos in your free time. And then slowly over time, they'll go from red to yellow to green, which means that you don't even need to watch the videos anymore because you've internalized the knowledge. Now, apart from watching the videos, you can also look through the flashcards that you created in the first step. And in the weekends, you can take maybe 1 hour or so to redo the practice questions that you're really struggling with. So this is a way to combine passive review with active review. So once you have about a month before the exam, that's when you can start working on mock tests to time yourself and imitate the real testing environment. And since you already have a very strong foundation in each individual topic, the mock test is not going to be as intimidating. So this strategy is essentially the ideal formula to take a huge amount of material and internalize it as quickly as possible to put yourself in the best position to pass the test. So that is it. I hope that this helped demystify the CFA prep process a little bit for you and that it gave you a clear path as to how you can succeed in the exam.